They didn't build pyramids. They didn't carve faces into mountains. They left behind no great temples, no epic poems, no sprawling cities of stone. And yet, they ruled the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. The Mongols, most of the time, they said little. They rode far. They slept under stars. They trusted the wind more than written words. They had no capital for a long time, no fixed palaces. Their empire moved with hooves and wheels. And for many years, no one noticed, just whispers in the east. Tribes gathering, a new leader perhaps, but when they arrived like thunder. In less than 100 years, they swept from the Korean coast to the gates of Vienna. They took China. They shattered Persia. They burned cities, broke empires, and vanished again before anyone truly understood who they were. And then, like a breath, they were gone. The Mongol Empire faded, not with rebellion, not with invasion, but with dispersal, like dust, like wind. Historians write about their tactics, their cruelty, their horses, their bows. But rarely do we pause to notice the silence between the battles, the discipline of their riders, the patience of their messengers, the way they crossed entire continents without, leaving scars of marble. This is not a story of conquest. Not really. It is the story of an empire that was built in motion. An empire made not of stone, but of air, of steppe, of rhythm. You won't find the Mongols in museums of grandeur. They preferred leather to gold, simplicity to ceremony, speed to architecture, and yet they changed everything. Trade routes, religions, borders, languages, diseases, maps, and perhaps they changed history precisely because they never tried to leave a mark. They simply rode on. So tonight, we drift across the steppe. We follow hoofprints, long faded. We listen to stories carried by dust and retold by moonlight. This is the story of the Mongols, not the warriors, not the legends, but the wind behind them, the silence they rode with, and the quiet world they left behind. Sleepy history begins with a breeze. Out on the steppe, there is no ceiling, only sky that the land rolls, endless and quiet. Grass bends, but never breaks. The wind whistles, not as a visitor, but as a resident. This is where the Mongols come from silence, from space, from a world that doesn't shout, but waits. In this vastness, in the middle of the 12th century, a boy was born. They named him Temujin. No fireworks, no palace bells, just the sound of his mother's breath and the wind curling through the felt of their yurt. He was born clutching a blood clot in his hand. The elders said it was a sign that he would be a great warrior, but for many years he was simply hungry. Temujin's early life was not dramatic. It was difficult. Like many children of the steppe, he lived in rhythm with the herds. He learned to ride before he could write. He knew the taste of mare's milk. He feared wolves more than enemies. His tribe, the Borgagin, was not the strongest. His father, Yasuge, was a chieftain, but even that meant little. On the steppe, alliances shifted with the wind. One moment you shared a fire, the next a betrayal. When Temujin was 9, his father was poisoned by rivals. The family, once protected, was suddenly abandoned. Temujin, his mother, and siblings were left to starve. Literally, they ate roots, mice, strips of leather, softened in water. They survived because they had no other option. It was in these quiet years, not on a battlefield, that Temujin learned power. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. How to wait, how to endure, how to remember. His mother Holen was his first teacher. She told him, "A man's strength is not in his sword, but in his word." Temujin listened in silence. He made friends carefully, among them Jamuka, a boy of noble birth. They swore brotherhood, played, laughed, dreamed, and one day would become enemies. But not yet. By his teenage years, Temujin had already tasted exile, starvation, and captivity. At one point, he was enslaved by another tribe. They tied a wooden collar around his neck so he couldn't run. But he didn't fight. He watched. He waited. And one night, he escaped. Not with violence, with silence. This was the way of the steppe. Wars were loud, but power was quiet. Married young, his wife was Bert. She brought him loyalty, and later, tragedy. She was kidnapped by rival tribes, taken, used. Temujin did not scream. He gathered a handful of allies, struck quickly, retrieved her, and said little. By his early 20s, Temujin had already seen what many never survived: betrayal, starvation, captivity, loss. But instead of crumbling, he became steel, not loud, clashing steel. Cold, patient steel. He didn't claim a throne. He didn't build a city. He built trust, across tribes, across bloodlines. He elevated men based on talent, not family. He remembered names, paid debts, forgave slowly, and when he moved with certainty. Out on the steppe, the sky does not hurry. Neither did Temujin. He was becoming something the world had not yet imagined. Not a warlord, not a king, but a storm, a slow, gathering storm. Temujin didn't begin with an army. He began with promises, soft-spoken ones, made around fires, under stars, over bowls of fermented milk. He offered something strange to the men of the steppe: fairness, not birthright, not noble blood, but loyalty. You followed him, he rewarded you. No matter your clan, no matter your past, it was unheard of. For centuries, Mongol tribes had lived in webs of old names and grudges. Each clan had its own chieftain, its own honor, its own pride. Temujin, instead, asked for trust, and strangely, he got it. One rider, then 10, then hundreds. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't carry banners, but they listened to one man, to one rhythm. Temujin created his first decimal army, 10 men, then 100, then 1,000. Each unit had a leader. Each leader reported up. No confusion, no shouting. Orders whispered, then obeyed. This was a different kind of power, not loud, not ceremonial, efficient, quiet, deadly. He trained them not just to ride. They practiced switching horses mid-gallop, firing arrows backward, packing for weeks with no campfires. They studied maps in their heads. They learned how to survive on frozen air and dried meat. When Temujin's enemies mocked him, they called him lucky, small, common. But he remembered. He remembered every insult, every betrayal, every moment they left his mother to starve. And when he struck back, he didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he simply appeared. The Merkits, who kidnapped his wife, defeated. The Tatars, who poisoned his father, wiped out. But not with cruelty for cruelty's sake. Temujin's retribution had logic, purpose, pattern. He kept the useful, spared craftsmen, recruited rivals, absorbed their skills, their horses, their women, their weapons, not to flaunt, to function. By his late 20s, Temujin's name was known across the steppe. Still, many refused to follow him. They clung to old ways, old tribes, old oaths. So he made a choice: break the steppe at a great council. A Kurultai he stood among the Khans. Men older than him, richer, more decorated, and he told them, from this day forward, no more tribal division, no more favoritism, no more revenge killings. From now on, there is only one law, the YASSA.1 code. One empire. Some laughed, others listened, most watched. Temujin didn't argue. He waited, and one by one, the tribes began to tilt toward him. It wasn't a wave. It was a slow, grinding shift. By 1206, after decades of quiet expansion, a new Kurultai was called. This time, no one laughed. Temujin was named Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The steppe bowed, not because they were forced, but because they were ready. He had no palace, he had no crown, but he had something no other man on the steppe had: unity. His army moved as one, not because of drums, but because of trust. They used smoke signals, horse relays, coded knots. They knew how to disappear and reappear. Days later, miles away, unstoppable, and yet, still. Genghis did not rush. He paused. He waited. He studied maps of lands he'd never seen. He questioned travelers, scholars, runaway monks. He prepared, like a bow being drawn, not to scare, but to strike. The quiet empire was no longer just an idea. It had legs, and hooves, and breath, and it was about to move. Once, the steppe was enough. The wind, the horses, the stars. But now, Genghis Khan had unified it. It no longer whispered. It waited, and he listened. He didn't seek glory. He sought stability. Outside the grasslands, there were threats, kingdoms, with gold, fortresses, armies in silk and steel, and maps that didn't include the Mongols. That would change. But first, he tested his strength, not by charging, by sending messages, couriers, scouts, gifts, to the Western Xia kingdom, a small empire in northern China, proud, wealthy, and suspicious. Genghis asked for trade. They dismissed him, so he returned with silence. And an army. The Mongols had never besieged a city. They had no catapults, no siege towers, only riders and resolve. But they adapted fast. They watched, they learned. They captured enemy engineers and put them to work. Western Shire fell, not in flames, but in folds. The Mongols didn't destroy everything. They absorbed it. Languages, tactics, maps, roads. Genghis was building a toolkit, piece by piece. Next, the Jin dynasty, richer, stronger, much larger. The Jin ruled over northern China, fortified cities, massive walls, and a deep disdain for nomads. But Genghis didn't attack head-on. He divided his forces, attacked at night, circled the fortresses, cut off supplies, used fire, flood, and patience. Where armies failed, weather helped. Snowstorms, droughts, surprise in the city of Chengdu. Today's Beijing, the Jin waited behind walls 30 feet thick. The Mongols didn't retreat. They surrounded, waited. Waited, no shouting, no siege drums, just hooves on soil, breath in frost. Eventually, the city broke from within. Genghis took what he needed: food, horses, engineers, maps, then left, not as a tyrant, as a shadow. The world began to notice, whispers in Persia, worries in Europe. Who were these riders? They didn't stay. They didn't boast. They struck and vanished. But Genghis wasn't finished. His eyes turned west, toward the Khwarezmian Empire, a rising power in Central Asia, vast, organized, but arrogant. Genghis sent a peaceful trade mission, hundreds of merchants with gifts and goodwill. The Shah of Khwarezm had them all executed. No negotiation, no apology. Genghis Khan said nothing, not publicly. He simply gathered his forces, and then he moved. The invasion of Khwarezmia was not just war, it was a lesson. The Mongols crossed the desert, built bridges over rivers, split into coordinated groups, attacked multiple cities at once. They feigned retreat, then returned. They avoided cities, then flooded them. They respected no calendar, no season, no rule. Every town that resisted was destroyed. Those who surrendered were often spared. Genghis wanted one thing, message received. He wasn't a conqueror. He was a correction. In his mind, order was worth more than blood. But when order was broken, blood followed. By the end of this campaign, the Khwarezmian Empire no longer existed. It had taken a century to rise. The Mongols ended it in less than 2 years, and then they left no cities built, no statues erected, no poems carved into stone, just silence and hoofprints. By now, no one could ignore him. Genghis Khan, the man without a crown, without a city, without a golden throne, had reshaped the map. Not with speeches, not with monuments, with silence, with motion. He didn't leave ruins behind, he left. Patterns. Roads became straighter, trade faster, borders more fragile. His empire stretched from the Pacific coast to the Caspian Sea, and yet you could ride for days across it without seeing a palace. Only grass, only wind. He had no permanent capital, no royal court of marble, no grand cathedral echoing his name. Instead he had horses, messengers, laws written on leather, and eyes everywhere. The Mongol relay system, the Yam, was a network of outposts across the empire. Riders could deliver messages thousands of miles in mere days. There were no loud proclamations, only letters carried in bags, changed hands. Reed and whispers. He built unity. By building speed, information was power. Silence was safety. Control came not from fear, but from precision, and still, he was not finished. He sent envoys west, to Persia, to India, even to Europe. Some kings welcomed them, some did not. The ones who didn't would be remembered, but not by monuments, by ruins. Genghis Khan was not cruel by chaos. He punished betrayal, rewarded loyalty. He listened to scholars, promoted officials from different religions. He learned how cities breathed and how they died. He governed not like an emperor, but like a tactician. Every system he touched he simplified. Every enemy he met he studied. Every silence he read carefully, and then, in the summer of 1227, he fell from his horse. He was injured, and he died quietly. No last speech, no grand funeral procession, only a whisper through the camps. The Khan is gone. His body was carried away, secretly, hidden to this day. No one knows where Genghis Khan is buried. No tomb, no stone, just grass, and perhaps that's how he wanted it. No shadow, no shrine, just the echo of what he built, still riding across time. His sons would take up his path. His grandsons would ride further. They would reach the Danube, the Persian Gulf, the gates of Japan, but the stillness, the restraint, the quiet genius of the Mongol Empire began with him, with a boy once left to starve, who chose not to scream, but to wait and walk softly until the world leaned in. This is where the empire begins, not with noise, but with intention. The step is no longer still. It has become a storm, and now we ride into it. Genghis Khan was gone, but the horses kept riding. His sons, his generals, his secretaries, they did not pause, because silence was now a strategy and motion, a mandate. His third son, Ogedei, took the title of Great Khan, not by force, but by agreement. The Mongol Empire didn't collapse when its founder died. It simply changed riders. Ogedei was different. He drank too much, laughed louder. He built a capital Karakoram, though still modest and still surrounded by yurts. But he honored his father's rhythm: build fast, rule light, move always under. Ogedei, the empire doubled, and the world gasped to the north and west. A quiet commander named Subutai planned something no one had dared: a coordinated invasion of Eastern Europe. Yes, Europe. Subutai was not loud. He didn't boast. He rarely spoke in meetings, but he drew maps in the dirt and remembered every river crossing. In 1236, the Mongols rode into Russia's snow, forests, frozen rivers. It didn't slow them. They crossed the Volga, burned Ryazan, took Moscow, entered Kiev. Not with waves, but with rhythm. They struck. They waited. They struck again. They fought in silence, while the princes of Europe argued in councils. By the time anyone agreed to resist, the Mongols were already moving again. In 1241, they defeated Polish knights at Legnica. Then Hungarian forces at Mohi. Europe was open. No armies left, no walls prepared, and then they stopped. The great Khan Ogedei had died, and Mongol law required the generals to return to elect the next ruler. Even Subutai, who stood at the gates of Europe, turned his horse and left no loot, no celebration, just hoofbeats fading into forest. Europe was saved, not by strength, by silence. After Ogedei, the question of succession returned, not loudly but deeply. The Mongols didn't have a single throne. They had 4 Khanates, each with its own logic, its own wind. The unity began to stretch, but it didn't break. Not yet. In the east, a grandson named Kublai watched China carefully. He studied the Confucians, read Chinese poetry, sat in silence for hours, listening to bureaucrats argue about tax grain. He didn't belong, and yet he fit in. Kublai wasn't in a hurry. He appointed scholars, learned local dialects, built bridges, roads, storehouses. His tent became a palace, and slowly his palace became a dynasty. In 1271, Kublai declared the Yuan dynasty, a Mongol-led China. He moved the capital to what we now call Beijing. He wore Chinese robes, used Chinese laws, but never forgot his stepblood. He wasn't just a conqueror. He was a translator between nomad and farmer, saddle and scroll, sky and stone. Meanwhile, in the southwest, another grandson, Hulagu, led his riders into Persia and the Middle East. He crossed rivers dry with dust and entered cities. Wrapped in minarets, his target was Baghdad, the crown of the Islamic world, seat of the Abbasid Islamic health card. Baghdad was not just a city. It was a symbol, a capital of learning, home to the house of wisdom, and yet it fell. In 1258, the Mongols surrounded Baghdad, not with rage, but with ritual. They built earthworks, diverted water, cut the city off from its own breath. When they entered, they did not spare it. Libraries burned, scholars vanished, the caliph rolled in a carpet and trampled beneath hooves. No speech, no verdict, just dust. The Islamic world reeled. The Christian world blinked. Who were these men who spoke so little and moved so far? The answer, always, was in their rhythm. The Mongols did not occupy, they redirected, absorbed, replaced without rebuilding. Hulagu stayed for a time, established the Ilkhanate in Persia. He brought order, trade, paper money. He consulted astrologers, invited Buddhists, Muslims, Christians to court. He wasn't there to dominate. He was there to maintain motion. And yet, with every new ruler, something subtle shifted. The silence grew thinner. The old rhythms, just a little out of step. Some Mongols drank too deeply. Others argued too long. The simplicity faded. The patience frayed. The step was still there. But now there were walls and scrolls and rooms too quiet for wind. Still, the empire endured. For Khanates, the Yuan in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in Russia, each spoke in a different tone, but all whispered the same origin: a boy, born hungry, who once rode alone. Even the wind has limits. Even a storm grows tired, and so did the Mongol Empire. It wasn't a sudden fall, it was a soft pause, an invisible hesitation, like a rider slowing his horse. Before the world noticed, after Baghdad, Hulagu's army moved further west. But they met something they hadn't faced before: resistance. Not from empires, from dust, from the unknown. In 1260, the Mongols reached Ain Jalut, in what is now Palestine. There, a Muslim force known as the Mamluks stood ready. They knew the Mongols were fast, so they tricked them. They feigned retreat, a Mongol tactic. They lured the invaders in, then turned, and fought hard. Face to face, the Mongols lost. For the first time, they broke. No songs were sung, no horns sounded. The wind simply shifted. They retreated quietly. It was not the end, but it was a sign. Other frontiers proved just as stubborn. In Southeast Asia, monsoon rains turned roads to rivers. Elephants terrified horses. Jungles swallowed messengers. The Mongols tried to invade Vietnam multiple times. Each time they left soaked, sick, and slowed. Then came the sea. Kublai Khan, from his great palace in China, looked eastward to Japan. He sent letters, gifts, warnings. No reply, so he built a navy. Twice and twice. The sea replied with storms. The kamikaze, divine winds, tore through Mongol ships. Not because they were evil, because they did not belong. The sea had its own silence, and it was louder than any hoofbeat. The Mongols learned that not all lands could be bent, not all rhythms could be matched. And back home, the empire was changing. The Khanates began to bicker. Lines were drawn. Borders hardened. In Russia, the Golden Horde grew distant. In Persia, the Ilkhanate fell into civil wars. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khans split by bloodlines. And in China, Kublai's heirs struggled to rule a people they never fully understood. The great Yasa, the Mongol law, was rewritten, ignored, forgotten. Even the messengers stopped running on time. The empire had stretched so far that it could no longer hear itself. Its silence became disconnection, not a scream, not a collapse, just a gentle unraveling, like thread pulled slowly by time. When you walk through Europe, you see castles. When you visit Egypt, you see pyramids. In China, walls, palaces, scrolls. But when you search for the Mongols, you see wind, grass, and the faint outline of old roads. Their empire was the largest, contiguous land empire in human history. It connected more people, more cultures, more markets than any had before. And yet, they left behind almost nothing carved in stone. No temples, no marble gates, no libraries bearing their name. Only roots, languages, and change. One of the greatest legacies was the Silk Road. Before the Mongols, it was dangerous, unreliable, a patchwork of tolls, bandits, kingdoms. After the Mongols, it flowed from Venice to Beijing, from Cairo to Samarkand. Traders moved with protection. Ideas moved without walls. Paper money spread, printing spread, gunpowder spread, so did the plague. The Black Death traveled on Mongol routes, fleas on rats, rats in grain, grain in wagons. The same system that unified a continent, unleashed. A ghost the Mongols didn't know. They didn't mean to, but the silence of their conquest carried an invisible scream. 1/3 of Europe would die. Even so, the cultural impact remained. Muslims met Buddhists. Christians learned Arabic science. Chinese engineers built bridges in Persia. A Mongol passport could carry a merchant across 6,000 miles without a single checkpoint. Try that today, and then, as if by design, the Mongols faded. The Yuan dynasty in China collapsed. The Ilkhanate fragmented. The Golden Horde fell to civil war. The Chagatai Khanate broke apart. Within a few generations, the empire had vanished, not in flame, not in revolt, just gone, like a shadow at sunset. Today, historians struggle to categorize them. Were they nomads, or state builders, barbarians, or unifiers? Did they destroy civilization, or create a new one? We don't have many books, but we have their impact. We don't have many ruins, but we have their roads. We don't hear their voices, but we feel their silence. It's in how we trade, how we move, how we think about East and West, not as separate worlds, but as one continent, briefly united by horses and willpower. The Mongol Empire was not made to last. It was made to move. It wasn't built for eternity. It was built for impact, not to be remembered, but to be felt. They didn't leave monuments. They left momentum. And sometimes that's the loudest legacy of all. After the empire splintered, its pieces did not vanish. They scattered, like coals from a fire. Some faded. Some burned quietly in Central Asia. A prince named Tamerlane, or Timur, rose from the ashes. He wasn't a direct descendant of Genghis, but he claimed the bloodline. He fought like the Mongols, marched like the Mongols, destroyed, far more brutally. But he lacked something. Restraint. Tamerlane built pyramids of skulls. He razed cities to the ground. He conquered far, India, Syria, Anatolia, but he didn't build systems. When he died, his empire died with him, a spark, not a flame. Meanwhile, in the forests of Russia, the Golden Horde had splintered into Khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea. Sibathi ruled for centuries, but grew distant from their Mongol roots. They converted to Islam, adopted sedentary ways, spoke different languages, They weren't horse lords anymore. They were kings. In China, the Ming dynasty overthrew the Yuan. The Mongols were driven back to the steppe, but not erased. They remained in Inner Mongolia, watching, sometimes raiding, sometimes trading, but never again ruling, even in Korea and Japan. Stories lingered of thunder from the plains, of arrows that came from fog. Children played Mongol invasion in fields, without ever seeing a Mongol. In the Muslim world, maps were redrawn. Power moved to the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals. The Mughals, in India, took their name from the Mongols. Babur, their founder, was a descendant of Timur and Genghis. He brought gardens, architecture, order, and yet India barely remembers the steppe behind the stone. In Europe, the name Mongol faded into myth, feared, exaggerated, misunderstood. They became villains in operas, shadows in chronicles, footnotes in textbooks. No one remembered how close they came to rewriting the West. Even Marco Polo, who visited Kublai Khan's court, was doubted for centuries. Surely, Europeans thought, these riders couldn't be real. But they were, and still are, in names, in languages, in roads that follow ancient lines, in family trees that twist across Asia, in ruins that don't look Mongol, but were once passed over by hooves and breaths. Some Mongol clans still roam, they herd, they sing songs older than empires. They carry no flag, no anthem, just stories and rhythm. If you listen closely in the wind across the steppe, you might still hear it. Not an empire, a memory, with rains and silence. For centuries, the Mongols were remembered by others, not by themselves. Their own records were few, their buildings minimal, their statues nearly non-existent, so their story was borrowed, twisted, whispered. In the West, they became monsters. Inhuman, merciless, a faceless flood. Medieval chroniclers drew them as devils on horseback. Clawed hands, red eyes, arrows dipped in poison and fire. They were the scourge of God, the end of the world. And when they vanished, Europe never asked where they went. Instead, the silence of the Mongols became a vacuum, and fear filled it. Shakespeare never mentioned them. Voltaire ignored them. Even Enlightenment thinkers, who loved to classify everything, left them undefined. But in Asia, they were harder to forget. Chinese dynasties studied their laws. Korean legends feared their return. Islamic scholars debated their theology. The Mongols had touched too many borders to truly disappear in the 20th century. Historians began to reconsider, not to excuse, but to understand. They found a system of postal stations spanning Eurasia, a code of law that respected multiple religions, tolerance for merchants, scholars, and even enemies who surrendered. They found patterns, not chaos. They found diplomacy. Written in Persian, Chinese, Uyghur, Arabic, Latin, they found that Genghis Khan never allowed torture, and often spared cities that yielded, of course. There was blood, destruction, terror, but there was also structure, speed, simplicity, modern. Historians began to see something odd. The Mongols weren't unusually cruel. They were unusually effective, and that was terrifying. How do you classify a people who didn't build towers, but moved between them? Who didn't write books, but rearranged the libraries? Who left no anthem, but silenced kingdoms? Genghis Khan's name is now studied in military academies. His strategies, flanking, misdirection, decentralized command, are considered brilliant. Business schools cite his logistics. Anthropologists trace his genetics. one man, 10 million descendants, and counting. The narrative began to change, not from horror to heroism, but from noise to nuance. Because maybe it wasn't that the Mongols were too loud. Maybe we never listened properly. They didn't carve their story. In stone, they breathed it, and wind, it seems, takes longer to read. Picture the steppe today, a vast stretch of land, open, unfenced, unbotted. The wind still moves the grass. The sky still meets the earth without interruption. And somewhere in that space are the echoes of Hoofbeats. No marble ruins, no bronze. Statues, just bones, dust, and stories. So what does it mean when an empire this enormous leaves so little behind? Is that failure or something else? We measure civilizations by what they leave: temples, paintings, philosophies. But the Mongols didn't build, they moved, they connected. They cleared paths others would later walk. Maybe that's a kind of genius too, a silent one. They didn't codify a religion. They didn't invent a new language. They didn't compose symphonies, but they created possibility. They forced the world to acknowledge that borders are temporary, that distance can be conquered, that culture can be carried on horseback for a brief moment in history. The earth felt smaller. Venetian merchants reached China. Persian astronomers met Chinese engineers. Russian scribes read Arabic medicine. Indian art appeared in the Mongol courts, and then it ended. The connections frayed, the roads quieted. The empires reasserted their walls, and the Mongols slipped into myth. But what a strange myth they became. Villains, heroes, ghosts, they ruled without borders, conquered without monuments, and vanished without graves. In a world obsessed with permanence, the Mongols offer a different kind of legacy. A reminder that movement can be just as powerful as memory, that the wind, though invisible, shapes everything it touches. Maybe their story isn't one of destruction. Maybe it's a meditation on impermanence. They weren't loud, they weren't soft, they were inevitable. And then, like all things that ride too far, they rested. We often remember history by who stayed. The kings who ruled for decades, the dynasties who built capitals, the churches, the cathedrals, the carved names in stone. But the Mongols, they didn't stay. They arrived, they shifted everything. Then they disappeared. No mausoleum, no preserved body, not even a date on the calendar. Genghis Khan's tomb remains unfound. And maybe that's the point. He didn't want a grave. He wanted a world that moved, and move it did. The Mongols didn't create a civilization to last. They created a moment, a vast, synchronized moment across thousands of miles, dozens of cultures, hundreds of languages, a moment when distance shrank and fear expanded, a moment when silence became louder than armies. Most empires are remembered because of what they built. The Mongol Empire is remembered because of what it disrupted. It asked, what if power isn't about walls, but about motion? What if control doesn't come from noise, but from awareness? What if legacy is not something you carve into stone, but something you carry in the wind? We still don't know how they moved so far, so fast, with so few. We still don't fully understand how such a violent force could also be so organized, so restrained, so quiet. But perhaps we're not meant to understand. Perhaps we're just meant to remember, and not with fear, with awe, Because in a world where conquest is often loud, the Mongols showed how terrifying stillness can be. They didn't echo through history, they hushed it for a while, and in that hush, everything changed. Now, close your eyes for a moment. Picture the world before borders, before timetables, before planes, just land and wind and hoofbeats. A world where the earth itself was the map, where messages were carried not by wires, but by lungs and legs, where empires didn't expand with speeches, but with silence. The Mongols never built pyramids. They didn't etch their laws in marble. They didn't create national anthems or choreographed rituals. Instead, they built speed. They created possibility. For a brief moment, they tied the world together, from the Pacific to the Danube, from Siberia to Baghdad, from Korea to the coasts of France. The steppe had no borders, and for a while, neither did the world. But then they were gone, not wiped out, just absorbed, like wind into the leaves, like dreams into dawn. And maybe that's why they're so hard to remember, because memory craves shape, structure, edges, and the Mongols were movement, momentum, the space between things. Yet they're still here, not in palaces, but in patterns, not in symbols, but in systems. Trade routes still follow their paths. Courier services echo their yam. Negotiation tactics mirror their diplomacy. Logistics, supply chains, mobile warfare, all born, in part, from a people who rode more than they ruled. Their story, like this video, was not about drama, it was about rhythm, cadence, breath. Maybe you didn't notice the shift from conquest. Too quiet. Maybe it crept in like a change in the wind. Maybe somewhere along the way, you forgot this was a story about war, and remembered it was a story about silence. And that's what makes it so powerful. So restful, because sometimes the greatest empires don't roar. They whisper, and in that whisper, they shape the world. So tonight, as you rest, let that whisper carry you across the steppe, over rivers, beneath stars. Let your mind ride beside the calm, not in fear, but in wonder. Let the hoofbeats fade. Let the dust settle. Let the wind speak and sleep, knowing that even the quietest empires leave the deepest trails. Snoozy History, telling the stories the world forgot. In the tone your dreams remember.